Chapter 15. We'll be finishing the book today. The end of the story. By 1821, Wilberforce was in constant ill health and knew he needed a replacement to carry the abolitionist battle forward. His wife had urged him for years to retire from public life. In May of 1821, he asked Thomas Buxton to take the lead in the anti-slavery movement. But he didn't retire. In fact, 2 years later, in March of 1823, Wilberforce stood to introduce a petition for Parliament to free all the slaves by purchasing them from their masters. The motion was never debated and never voted on, and as it turned out, it was the last bill Wilberforce proposed in Parliament. From that time forward, Buxton took the lead, and he followed the practice that Wilberforce had pioneered so many years before. Every year he presented another motion to free the slaves. Parliament never acted on Buxton's motions, but as he spoke, and as his motions were at least briefly considered each year, he and the other abolitionists in Parliament kept the abolitionist cause before the House and did what they could to demonstrate that slavery was truly awful. By February of 1825, Wilberforce was so ill that he finally took Barbara's advice. He resigned from Parliament. 5 years later, in 1830, a general election was held. Wilberforce's county, Yorkshire, had grown to the point where it needed the right to elect not just 2, but 4 MPs, and all 4 were abolitionists. Clearly, the tide was turning. By 1832, the abolitionist members began to publish the names of candidates they considered anti-abolition, doubtful, and recommended. The publication of these lists increased the number of abolitionists in the House. When a newly elected Parliament first sat, it was a tradition for the King to address the Assembly. During these speeches, he would tell Parliament what issues he believed were the most important and what things he most wanted them to work on. In 1833, the King followed this tradition. In his speech, he said nothing about slavery. As soon as Buxton realized what had happened, he stood and gave notice that he intended to bring a motion concerning slavery. The Prime Minister was alarmed. He went to Buxton privately and urged him to drop the matter. Buxton refused. After a prolonged argument, the Prime Minister finally admitted defeat. "Well, then," he said, "if you will not back down, then we, the government, must." And so he set a date on which the government would express its views on the matter and on which a full debate could take place. In preparing for the upcoming debate, the abolitionists circulated pamphlets and asked for petitions. They held meetings and sponsored lectures all over the country. In the midst of this activity, Wilberforce was asked to sign a petition. He was also invited to attend a meeting. He was more than 73 years old and extremely frail, but he agreed to go. Once he arrived at the meeting, though he had often declared that his speaking days were over, someone convinced him to take the floor. One observer said that Wilberforce was so frail and his body so twisted that he seemed to sink right into his cloak. His voice, too, was only a faint shadow of what it had been 30, 40, or 50 years before, but somehow the passion of the old warrior came through. Years earlier, when Wilberforce had been in his first term as an MP, Boswell, a famous commentator, had heard Wilberforce speak. Afterward, Boswell wrote, "I saw what seemed a mere shrimp rise to speak, but as I listened he grew and grew until the shrimp became a whale." That is how it had been in March of 1784. The same happened again in April of 1833, almost 50 years later. "I had never thought to appear in public again," said Wilberforce, "but it shall never be said that William Wilberforce is silent when the slaves require his help." And so he affirmed that the institution of slavery should be abolished. I say, and I say honestly and fearlessly, that the same being who commands us to love mercy says also, "Do justice." And therefore I have no objection to give the colonists whatever relief may be due them for any real harm they may suffer as a result of losing their slaves. Wilberforce's proposal seemed little different from motions that he and Buxton had proposed, and that had been rejected by Parliament every year, for years beyond counting. To anyone looking on from the sidelines, the speech of this frail old man must have seemed a waste of breath. But when a beam of sunlight suddenly burst through the window and lit his face, Wilberforce exclaimed, "Freedom is bright before us. The light of heaven beams on that goal, and that light is a promise of success." Somehow, despite all the opponents lined up against him, Wilberforce made it sound as if he believed victory was near. If he was correct, however, it soon seemed obvious that he would never see the victory. By early May, a month and a half after he made the speech, he was confined to bed and fighting for his life. On May 14th, the colonial secretary gave Parliament a stack of petitions signed by almost 1.5 million Englishmen. The petitions asked for the slaves to be completely freed. Stanley also presented a bill to emancipate the slaves. The bill said that all slaves should be freed in 1 year. The freed slaves should then be apprenticed to their former masters for 12 years. Furthermore, Stanley's bill said in order to ease difficulties for the owners who would lose the services of their slaves, the government should guarantee to the slave owners loans worth £15 million. When Stanley ended his speech, it was obvious that neither the slave owners nor the abolitionists were satisfied with his proposal. At the same time, however, neither side seemed ready to object to it, at least not in principle. The planters simply pointed out that loans would be of little value, and the abolitionists protested that 12-year apprenticeships were far too long. So Stanley modified his proposal: give the planters an outright gift of £20 million and shorten the apprenticeships to 7 years. On July 24th, 1833, the gift of £20 million was approved in committee. It passed by a vote of 158 to 151. The next day, the shorter period of apprenticeship was passed, and the day after that, on July 26th, Commons passed the whole bill. No one doubted the bill would pass Lords. When Wilberforce was informed of the vote, he said, "Thank God that I should have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give £20 million to abolish slavery." Having lived to see his lifelong dream achieved, it was as if he had been given freedom to die. The next day, on Saturday, his health suddenly worsened. By Sunday, July 28th, he was in a coma, and at 3 in the morning on July 29th, 1833, he died. 1 year later, almost to the day, at 12 midnight on July 31st, 1834, 800,000 slaves were freed in all the British territories. One of Wilberforce's biographers, Reginald Copeland, wrote, "It was more than a great event in African or in British history. It was one of the greatest events in the history of the world." Chapter 16, the last chapter. What else did Wilberforce accomplish? Besides the abolition of slavery, Wilberforce worked vigorously toward the reformation of manners in British society, and he made significant progress in this area, even while he made noteworthy contributions to other matters as well. The Proclamation Society. One day, Wilberforce observed to a friend that when a society values religious faith, there often seems to be a great deal of religious hypocrisy. People pretend to be more devout, more righteous than they really are. But he said, "I wonder if we now have a different kind of hypocrisy. Are people now acting worse than they would if left to their own devices? Is it possible that they think it is fashionable to be immoral?" This thought particularly bothered him as he considered how British society responded to class distinctions, the differences between rich and poor. He realized that, just as we see today, poor people were fascinated by the rich and famous. Moreover, and as is also common today, the wealthy often got away with truly outrageous behavior. A wealthy man who became drunk and killed another person might receive a mild warning and be let go. Not so for the poor. A poor father who stole some food to feed his family could, and too often was, hanged for his offense. Wilberforce reasoned that if the poor follow the example of the rich, then the rich themselves need to act better. Change needs to start at the top. Improved behavior of the wealthy could prevent a major source of grief in poor households, not to mention the wealthy households themselves. As he was thinking about these things, Wilberforce noted that the kings of England traditionally made special proclamations when they were crowned king. These proclamations had been a tradition ever since King William and Queen Mary came into power in 1692. King George's proclamation of 1760 was typical. It spoke against excessive drinking, blasphemy, profane swearing, and other such things. In his proclamation, King George also urged his subjects to do good. All persons of honor or authority, he said, should set good examples and seek to help reform persons of dissolute and debauched lives. So the king himself seemed concerned about issues that disturbed Wilberforce. Wilberforce discovered that when William and Mary issued their proclamation in 1692, public morals had actually improved. But the proclamations since that time had made almost no difference at all. People ignored them, and he wondered why. As he studied the issue, Wilberforce noticed that William and Mary established local societies to help government officials detect crimes. The kings who issued proclamations after William and Mary never established such societies, they simply issued proclamations. So Wilberforce thought, did the societies make the difference? What if we created such societies, or one such society today? And so he determined to form a group to promote the idea that it is fashionable to do good. Maybe then people who are trying to make names for themselves by looking as bad as possible might change their behavior. Instead of trying to outdo each other and appearing wicked, perhaps they will seek to engage in kinder and more considerate behavior. As a result, in 1787, just a few months before the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade approached him, Wilberforce founded the Proclamation Society. The society would call people to pay attention to the king's proclamation. Its members would do whatever they could to encourage people, especially the wealthy, to conduct themselves with integrity and greater concern for public morality, and in the end, hopefully, influence British society as a whole for the better. Society for Bettering the Condition of the Poor. Some critics claimed that Wilberforce was only concerned about slaves and showed little interest in British laborers' working conditions. But long before they raised these objections, Wilberforce had helped found the Society for Bettering the Condition of the Poor, a group that worked to establish laws to improve working conditions. In particular, the society sought to improve children's working conditions and to restrict their working hours. Wilberforce helped to draft the labor bills and supported them in Parliament. In 1802, he helped pass a bill that ended forced apprenticeships. It forbade the cotton and woolen mills from having apprentices work after 9 o'clock at night, before 6 in the morning, or for more than 12 hours a day. Yes, prior to that time, children often worked more than 12 hours in a day. By 1817, 15 years later, you could hardly find any apprentices. Apprenticeships had been almost completely eliminated, but they had been replaced by child wage slaves. So the bill that controlled the working conditions for apprentices still had no effect on 9 out of 10 child laborers. As a result, the society pressed to limit the conditions under which children could work. For example, they proposed that children younger than 9 should be banned from working in cotton mills or factories. They also sought to prohibit employers from requiring children aged 16 and younger to work more than 12 and a half hours a day. It took 5 years, from 1815 to 1819, before Parliament finally agreed on that legislation. Broader impact on British politics. As we've already seen, Wilberforce wanted British culture to become more moral. His goal was for society as a whole impacted Parliament. As Garth Lean writes, when he began, Wilberforce was one of 3 members of Parliament vaguely identified with vital Christianity. In the next 50 years, over 100 members sat in the House who thought as he did, and an equal number were active in the House of Lords. Their presence did much to transform the House from a club mainly concerned with the interest of its members to an assembly responsible for the public good. He and his friends introduced wider issues and established these. Issues ought to be decided not by self-interest, but by moral right. During the succeeding century, statesmen, to be successful, were compelled to live, or at least pretend to live, morally